The ban list is here, and that means we have a brand new format, so you need to know which hand traps are the most important to beat the best meta decks. What's up, Ocean? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. Today, we're talking about hand traps post ban list and how they're going to interact with some of the best decks in the meta. We got a brand new format that we're all trying to figure out, and this video should help with that. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 150 likes, then I'll make sure to bring you a guide to the best board breakers post ban list as well in the upcoming formats. Also, if you like deck profiles, combo guides, meta discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel. So make sure to subscribe and help us reach our new goal of 5,000 subscribers. That being said, here is your guide to the best hand traps in the post-January 2024 ban list in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh. Let's jump into it. So I have 6 different categories for us to place these cards, the first of which is going to be to see play in most main decks. We also have some main decks as well as most side decks and some side decks, but we also have 2 other smaller categories. Those are going to be niche, where they have very little application or ability to be played in very few decks, and of course our favorite category, the just don't category. Do not play these cards right now. They do not make any sense to be in your main or side deck right now under almost any circumstance. Now I do want to say that last time I made a video like this, I had a lot of comments that were basically saying, why would you put this card in this category? It's so much worse than a card in a category above it. And I get it. Okay, but that's not how this is going to work. We're actually looking at the categories themselves and talking about why they're going to belong in those categories. So for example, just because a card is in the some main decks tier doesn't mean it's necessarily better than a card in the most side decks tiers. Most of the time it'll be the case, yes, but think of a card that could just be played in a very few amount of main decks, but is so good when it can be played. That'll fall into the some main decks tier, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily a better or more important card than a card that falls in the most side decks tier. So I hope you guys understand that. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on to our first card we're going to talk about in alphabetical order. It's going to be Artifact Lancea. Lancea is a real challenge to use in this format right now. There are so many decks that really don't care too much about this card. A lot of decks in previous formats really were affected heavily by it, but right now, the fact that you can only use it on your opponent's turn and only last that turn, it is a little bit tough to use. The card is fine against decks like Tierlist and Rescue Ace because the shufflers have to banish themselves to be able to activate their effects, and of course you can use it against Rescue Ace because they have to banish cards to summon out something like Turbulence. It just makes it a little bit harder for them to get Turbulence out on their side of the field. But it's really bad against decks like Fire King, Purely, Unchained, and of course Vanquish Soul as well. They really don't care about this card at all. I want to put it into niche, but in reality, just don't play this card. Ash Blossom is good against pretty much almost everything in the game right now. It has a really wide application against a ton of decks. Now, it's not a card that can just stop a deck in its tracks completely unless you're playing branded, but honestly, because it has so much utility against so many decks, and there's so much searching or sending to grave or special summoning in this format right now, Ash is an amazing card. It's great against Rescue Ace for Hydrant, against Purely for pretty much everything, Unchained for the traps, and again, the monsters that summon from deck as well. It's also really good against Chimera Branded for Branded Fusion or the Berfomet, Labyrinth for either the Welcome traps, of course. Fire King is awesome against the Field Spell, and Infernoble for like Neospace Connector. It's a card that very rarely can just end the turn in an instant, but because it's so good against so many different cards, I believe that right now it is the best hand trap in the format. So for that reason, Ash Blossom belongs in the most main decks tier. Bystials are really format dependent. In a format that's heavily light and dark based, they are absolutely incredible. But because we're entering into a format that is so heavily focused on fire attributed monsters, we're not going to see Bystials seeing too much play. Think of it, some of the best decks in the upcoming format and in today's format right now are going to be Rescue Ace, Fire King, Snake Eye, and of course Infernoble. All these cards, all these decks do not care at all about what Bystials can do to them. Against all the best decks in the format today, I would argue that right now they're only really good against one deck, and that's going to be Tierlist. Against the rest, they're either just average or just plain bad in general. Unless they're part of your actual engine, Bystials belong in the niche tier. Chaos Hunter should not be played right now. Going neg1 to be able to summon this card out to prevent banishing is one thing, but then you can turn on your opponent's thrusts and talents, which are both incredibly strong. It's bad against pretty much everything else. Even back in tier format when we were seeing a lot more banishing and this card was seeing some play, right now it's just not seeing the same amount. It doesn't need to be played at all. Honestly, just don't play it. Moving on to Contact C. While it's on the field, your opponent can't special summon from the extra deck unless they use it as material. Now, normally that'd be like fine, I guess, but right now, do not use this card because one of the best cards in the game is SP Little Knight, which requires any 2 monsters to basically summon itself out. So if you're just going to go into either IP with it or SP Little Knight, then you kind of turn on the rest of their engine going, and they have one of the best pieces of removal in the entire game. Giving your opponent easy access to SP is never something that you want to do. So for that reason, just don't play this card. DD Crow is actually a really good card in today's format. Pretty much every single one of the top meta decks uses the graveyard for some reason or another. If you're playing against a deck like Fire King, it's great because if you can use it in the draw phase before they get the chance to search with Barong or a way to get the recovery back with Ponix, you're in a great position. It's also really good against decks like Unchained because you can get rid of their only copy of Shayama or even potentially the Yama as well. Centurion's main combo gets interrupted, and Rescue Ace, Versus, and even Runic Bystial are at least a little bit annoyed by it. It has a ton of application in this format, and honestly, right now I would say it's definitely better than Bystials because the card just doesn't care about what the attribute is in the graveyard. The question is it really that impactful of a hand trap? And if you're playing at a really high event like a YCS, it may not be depending on what you're playing against. People can learn how to play against DD Crow. It may not always interrupt their combo, and you might want to have something that's a bit more turn-endingly good if you're going to be playing a card in your side deck. So while I can make an argument for you to side it against so many different decks, should you actually do that? And honestly, the answer is probably not, because most of the time there's going to be a better option against a specific deck. The question is, can you find it in your specific list? As good as the card is, it should only see play in some side decks. Dimension Shifter is still one of the most oppressive hand traps the game has ever created. This card is absolutely insane against so many different decks. It's great against Unchained, Tier, Labyrinth, especially when you're looking at the furniture cards. It's great against Fire King. Anything that really wants to use the graveyard hates to deal with Dimension Shifter. Unchained and Labyrinth are at least able to wait it out or just play through it entirely depending on their hand, but they could lose a lot of resources. D-Shifter has some amazing matchups, but it also has some really bad matchups. If you have D-Shifter against Fluandereeze, that does absolutely nothing for you, so why play it against that deck? It's also a card that not every deck can actually use well, so while I'd argue it's one of the best hand traps today, it's only going to see play in some main decks. Droll and Lockbird is another card that's either amazing or just average at best. Honestly, there are so many decks right now that do a ton of different searching and that really hate dealing with Droll and Lockbird. If you're going to be playing against a deck like Dragon Link or Vanadium, or even a deck like Fire King, depending on what their hand could look like, you're in a really good position to shut them down with Droll. Some players even decide to start their turn off by special summoning Fenrir and using its effect to search, and if you hit them with Droll after that, then you could potentially just turn off their entire turn. The card is really important in this format because it's one of the best ways to stop these heavy monster combo decks from setting up a million negates and just shutting down what you want to do. So having access to Droll and Lockbird really limits what they can actually put up as their end board. That's why while I think it's an amazing card, it should only see play in most side decks. Moving on to Effect Veiler. Effect Negation in general is really great. Think about cards like Turbulence or Rhino Heart or Tour Guide are all really good to hit with Effect Veiler, but a lot of decks can just play right through it with the right hand. For example, if you attempt to Veiler a Tour Guide and they have Sharvara in hand to destroy the Tour Guide, because the Tour Guide will be destroyed by the time the effect of Veiler can resolve, it'll still actually go through with its effect. And because it can only be used during your opponent's main phase, it turns on cards like Thrust and Talents, which is really unfortunate. Now, I'll be honest, it's not really a card I would consider siding too often. It's mostly a card that you see being played in the main deck if they really need an extra piece of effect negation. So, for that reason, I'll put Veiler in the some main decks tier. Considering we just talked about Effect Veiler, instead of going in alphabetical order, let's just skip right away to Infinite Impermanence right now, which is basically just a better version of Effect Veiler. Because it's a power crept version of Effect Veiler, you would know that it's a better card. Not only can it be used on both players' turn, it's a trap card, which means it can't be hit with something like Called by the Grave, which is really nice, and it doesn't turn on Thrust and Talents, is also really strong. The card isn't always going to be the best and has some of the same weakness that Effect Veiler does, but what it can do is at least impact the game in some way or another, or at least force something out, or in the worst case, even be just effect negation on your turn to be able to bait something out as a board breaker instead. For that reason, it belongs in the most main decks tier. Fantastical Dragon Fantasmay. So since the last time I made this list, Fantasmay has been gaining more and more popularity. Now, not every deck link summons, and you need to go up against another deck that actually likes to link summon to really get the max benefit from this card. But what we're seeing now is Fantasmay being used less as a card to interrupt your opponent, and more as a card to be able to dig through your deck as much as possible to find cards that are these massive blowout cards against other strategies. If you're able to draw into something like a Droll and Lockbird, it can shut down a deck pretty quickly. If you're able to draw into a Nibiru for crying out loud, that'd be absolutely amazing as well. So for that reason, this card is seeing more and more play. The card gets you a 2400 attack body on the field right away, which is really nice. It also protects from targeting, which is cool too, but more importantly, it gives you even material to go into SP Little Knight right away. Speaking of Little Knight, because most people are trying to go into Little Knight as early as possible for an amazing interruption, having this card in your hand is almost always going to be live, and that's absolutely incredible. Originally, I was going to put this in the some side decks tier, but after seeing many top 64 decks from YCS Bologna side this card, I'm going to say it should see play in most side decks. Ghost Belle is such an unimpressive card in this format. Sure, you can use it on a wide variety of decks, including Unchained, Tierlist, Fire King, Infernoble, and more. It's just its impact is so minimal. But because of its attribute and the fact that it doesn't target, it is seeing play in some decks, but it's really rare. So I'd put it into the niche tier. Ghost Mourner is another very interesting card. It's effect negation, but it also is a way to help you win the game in time. You would think that's not so bad, but considering it's fighting for spots in the deck with Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence, you know it's pretty clearly going to be the worst of all three options because this card has to only activate on the special summon of a card. It's seeing play right now because some decks have so much space for non-engine that they can fit in 20 different hand traps, and they need to have something for effect negation, so they want to go with something like the Ghost Mourner. But is it going to be the best situation most of the time? Probably not. So for the time being, I'd say it belongs in the some side decks tier, but if its usage keeps up, it'll probably drop to niche. Ghost Ogre is so good against some very limited decks in the format right now, but honestly, where it shines the most is against some individual cards that are seeing a lot of play right now. Cards like SP Little Knight and King Sarcophagus. Activating either effect and chaining Ghost Ogre is really strong because destroying the SP Little Knight is one of the most important things that you can do in a matchup, because getting to SP Little Knight wars can be really difficult. Some decks is really good against include Centurion because they have a Primera, a Trudea, or whatever in their spell and trap zone. They activate the effect to special summon it out, and you go Ghost Ogre, it goes to the graveyard instead, which is great for you. It's also really good against Fire King, specifically because of Fire King Island. Now granted, this doesn't work if they have Fire King Sanctuary in their spell and trap zone because they can just protect from the destruction. But if they go Fire King Island to destroy and search, then you can chain Ogre, destroy that card, so not only do they not get the destruction, they don't get the search, and all their monsters are getting blown up as well, which is really strong. So while Ogre isn't a bad card, it's just not impactful enough this format, so for that reason it goes in the niche tier. As for Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, in theory it can be really good against cards like specifically SP Little Knights, or just Yama in Unchained for example, or Expurely Noir in the Purely matchup. It can be solid, but it's so difficult to actually play this card correctly. The biggest issue is that you have to play it basically in the mirror match, or in a deck that doesn't care about the extra deck very much at all. And honestly, if you don't care about the extra deck, you're better off playing cards like Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Prosperity for consistency pieces to find cards that are just better than Ghost Reaper, so why play this card? So for that reason, just don't play Ghost Reaper. As for Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood, now listen, the last time I did one of these tier lists, I put this card in the just don't tier, and I think I kind of gave it a bit too much of a tough time, because while I believe the card is a bad card objectively, the fact that it has some utility in time as a side deck card is actually really nice. Because that's the only utility for this card, in formats where time doesn't really matter, like in Master Duel for example, or in just more relaxed TCG events, it's just a terrible card in general. But with all that being said, because we're talking about the TCG, this card belongs in the some side decks tier. Gnomaterial is another card that in theory can be absolutely amazing, but it's so hard to pull off correctly. I was actually trying to find some situations where it'd be better to use Gnomaterial than another card, and it's so rare to pull these off, so for that reason I just wouldn't even bother. The point is, because it's so hard to get Gnomaterial to work correctly, just don't play it. Nibiru is another card that is seeing a lot of play right now. At the bare minimum, people are side decking it, but it's also seeing a lot of play in main decks right now. The card really punishes players for overextending, but when it's at its best is when you pair it with another hand trap like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence to use as a board breaker too. As the format keeps evolving and we eventually get Phantom Nightmare, I think the card will get even better as we go. For the time being though, I'll place Nibiru in the some main decks tier. Not many decks can afford to play PSY-Framegear Gamma. One of the reasons why is because it's so inconsistent. On top of that, what's the advantage of playing Gamma right now in the format when you'd be playing other hand traps? There's only two decks in my opinion that can justify playing Gamma even though it's at 1 in the TCG. That's going to be Dragon Link and Labyrinth, and honestly, most of these builds are deciding to cut this card anyways for more other consistency pieces in the strategy. So with that being said, I'll put Gamma in the niche tier. As for Retaliating Sea, unironically, Retaliating Sea isn't actually that bad of a card because we're in a format right now that relies heavily on the Sinful Spoils engine. And what does the original Sinful Spoils do? Well, it's a spell card that special summons a monster from the deck, which is really good because it meets the activation trigger for cards like Retaliating Sea to special summon itself. Now while Retaliating Sea will banish all the cards, honestly, a lot of the time people can just go into something like an early SP Little Knight to banish the copy of Retaliating Sea to just play around it either way. So for that reason, it really doesn't matter too much. In my opinion, it's a really bad format for Retaliating Sea, so for that reason, just don't play it. As for Sauravis, the Ancient and Ascended, this is a really interesting and unique hand trap that basically just protects from targeting. So if you're getting hand trap with something like an Effect Veiler or an Infinite Impermanence, you can go ahead and use Sauravis and protect yourself as well. But because of that, it's actually really rare to see play, and not many decks can take advantage of it. So for that reason, I'm going to place it in the niche tier. Meister has a lot of utility in this format because it hits a wide range of decks, from Tierlist to Unchained and Fire King to even Infernoble, but it's seeing very little play. Why is that? Well, the reason is because just like Ghost Belt, there are so many better options to interact with the graveyard than Meister, so it's not seeing play. So for that reason, Meister lands in the niche tier. And finally, the last hand trap we're going to talk about today is going to be Token Collector. Now this card here is terrible. Why? There are no decks that actually effectively use tokens in the format today, so do not play this card. It is the simplest thing. Just don't play Token Collector right now. And that is it. My tier list for the best hand traps post January 2024 ban list is looking like this. I think the list looks pretty damn good, but I want to hear from you. What do you think about the list? Let me know down in the comments. If you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it even just a little bit, so do me a favor and smash the like button. If this video hits 150 likes, then I'll bring you a guide to the best board breakers post ban list as well. Speaking of the ban list, if you want a guide on how to beat one of the best decks post ban list, then make sure to check out my guide on how to beat Fire King. That video is right over here. And finally, consider subscribing for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos, and of course helps reach our new goal of 5,000 subscribers. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.